A tourist who decided to extinguish his cigarette on a guardsman's uniform was confident he'd get away with it. But the way the guardsman responded shocked everyone. Winter in London was in full swing, with a biting wind weaving its way between the towering gates of Buckingham Palace. Tourists, bundled up in scarves and hats, crowded along the railings, holding their phones and cameras at the ready. The noise of the crowd, a mix of laughter, excited exclamations, and the clicks of shutters, echoed across the square, creating an atmosphere of lively chaos. For many, this was the moment they had dreamed of capturing. The Royal Guard, a symbol of the grandeur of the British monarchy, standing watch. On duty, as still as a statue, stood William, a fair-skinned man in his 30s with a perfectly straight posture and a gaze fixed into the distance. His red tunic looked as though every fold and button had been checked 100 times before he stepped out. The massive bearskin hat sat flawlessly on his head, adding even more to his imposing image. He was the embodiment of discipline and honor, standing there not just as a soldier but as a living symbol of a centuries-old tradition. William was used to tourists. He knew that for many, this was a show. People laughed, snapped silly photos, and sometimes tried to catch his eye or provoke a reaction. He saw it every day, but his job was to remain unflinching. Today was supposed to be no different, or so he thought. Among the crowd, a tourist appeared who immediately drew attention with his behavior. A fair-skinned man in his 40s, sporting a large belly that was especially noticeable due to the way his poorly fitted jacket strained at the zipper. It seemed ready to burst, as if protesting the load. His worn-out jeans had clearly seen better days. His face was flushed, whether from the cold or from having already warmed up with something stronger. In one hand he held a smoking cigarette, its lazy plume of smoke disrupting the frosty air. His other hand clutched a phone, poised to capture anything worth sharing later with a triumphant, "Look what I saw in London." But it was clear he wasn't looking for serene photo opportunities. No, this tourist craved attention. "Hey, look at this guy!" he shouted, pointing his cigarette in William's direction. His voice rang out as if he wanted not just the nearby people, but also the guardsman himself to hear him. "Is he even alive? Or is he just a statue?" The crowd began to turn toward the source of the noise. Some exchanged glances, others stifled a chuckle, but most simply watched. The tourist clearly felt like he was in his element. His loud laughter echoed across the square. "Seriously? Do they just put them here like museum exhibits? Look at him, not even a twitch," he continued, raising his phone to snap a few pictures. The crowd started murmuring. A few shook their heads in disapproval, but the tourist didn't notice. His loud remarks kept cutting through the air. "Oh, come on. I flew here on my own dime, you know. Where's the emotion? Come on, do something." His smug grin and taunting tone were practically begging for a reaction. But William didn't so much as blink. He stood as he always did, still, with a stony expression, just as he was trained to do. You see it too, don't you? The stark contrast between dignity and vulgarity. How could someone act like that? Would any of us be able to stand in William's place and maintain such composure? But the tourist clearly thought he was in charge. His cigarette smoldered, and he acted as if the very act of being there gave him some sort of authority, as if his presence alone entitled him to whatever he wanted. "Come on, man, at least smile. Show us you're human, not a mannequin," he added, laughing loudly and panning his phone around to record his little show. The mood in the crowd began to shift. Somewhere in the background, a woman whispered, "This is too much. Leave him alone." But the tourist paid no mind. For him, it was all just fun and games. William remained at his post. His face was a mask of stone, his posture unmoving. But you could tell, couldn't you? This was more than just composure. This was true resilience. And deep down, perhaps William knew. This wasn't even close to the worst he'd have to endure. The crowd, which had been passively watching the tourist, gradually began to view him as the main performer in this scene. Unfortunately, it was not a role worth boasting about. The man, clearly pleased with the attention he was getting, continued his act. He seemed to take the crowd's focus as a form of approval. With a smug expression, he stepped forward. Now he stood nearly at the edge of the white line that clearly marked the boundary between the guard's territory and that of visitors, a line that was off-limits in every sense. "Come on, buddy, give us a little smile. You're not a robot, are you?" he shouted, waving his cigarette dramatically, letting its smoke drift toward William. The crowd behind him chuckled. Smirks appeared on the faces of a few teenagers standing nearby. One of them pulled out a phone to start recording, as if this were something noteworthy, but another voice emerged. A woman in a dark navy coat standing nearby frowned and said, "Leave him alone. He's just doing his job." Her comment was calm but tinged with irritation. Like many others, she understood that tourists like him weren't just crossing lines of decency. They were turning tradition into a joke. "His job? Standing still like a statue?" The tourist shot back, turning toward the woman. His voice rose, ensuring everyone could hear him. "Any fool could do that. Watch this." He stood upright, stiffened his back, and mimicked the posture of a guard. Of course, his parody lasted only a few seconds before he broke into a laugh, lifting his cigarette to his lips for a smug drag, as if punctuating his performance. "Let's be honest. You can feel it too, can't you?" This man was so sure of his right to be there that he saw it as a license for any behavior. His words, his gestures, his self-satisfied smirk. It all screamed, "I paid to be here, so I can do whatever I want." And William? William stood firm, still as ever, his expression unflinching. His gaze remained fixed forward over the tourist's head, as if he didn't notice the scene at all. It was composure that could only be admired, but the tourist seemed to interpret the guard's silence as an invitation to keep going. His loud voice rang out again across the square. "Hey, anyone know how long they stand there? He must be on shift for hours. I wonder if he even knows what's happening around him." Some people laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of genuine amusement. It was the awkward kind of laugh people give when they don't know how to react to someone else's rude, inappropriate behavior. "Maybe his batteries ran out?" the tourist added, prompting a few more chuckles from the crowd. The woman in the navy coat, clearly unable to stay silent any longer, said firmly, "Stop it, you're embarrassing yourself." But her words fell on deaf ears. The tourist, reveling in his little show, merely scoffed. "Embarrassing? Oh, come on, it's all part of the act. That's why we came here, isn't it?" he declared, gesturing broadly to the crowd, as if trying to rally them to his side. "And you're probably thinking the same thing, aren't you? Do normal people act this way? Of course not, because someone with self-respect wouldn't turn another person's job into an excuse for humiliation. But the most remarkable thing about this scene was William. His face remained impassive. Even the slightest twitch of a brow would have given the tourist the victory he was clearly chasing, but it never came. The guardsman stood there, as he always did, embodying resilience in the face of absurdity and brazen disrespect. The crowd began to divide. Some clearly sided with the tourist, laughing at his antics. Others turned away in disapproval, murmuring to one another with obvious judgment. But the tourist didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. To him, the palace, the guards, the traditions, all of it was just a backdrop, created solely for him to feel important. And though the line hadn't yet been crossed, the tension in the air had reached its peak. One thing was clear. This wasn't over yet. The tourist, still basking in the crowd's attention, took another step forward, stopping mere inches from the white line. This line, the final barrier between audacity and outright disrespect, seemed to represent the last shred of decorum. The crowd fell silent, sensing the tension grow with every movement he made. "Come on, buddy. Show us you're alive, he shouted, pretending to snap his fingers in front of William's face. His voice echoed across the square, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. William's gaze, fixed somewhere in the distance, remained unchanged. But if you looked closely, you might notice the faintest tightening of his jawline. He stood there as a perfect embodiment of restraint, despite the circus unfolding around him. The tourist, interpreting the guard's silence as permission to continue, let out a smug chuckle. He took another drag from his cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke as he loudly declared, "You really are like a statue." The crowd began whispering among themselves. A few giggled nervously, but most faces displayed a mix of irritation and discomfort. A middle-aged woman in a navy coat frowned and leaned toward a man standing next to her, whispering, "This is so disrespectful. Why is he acting like that?" But the tourist seemed unfazed by such remarks. Posting another video or photo to social media clearly mattered more to him than the opinions of those around him. He raised his phone and snapped another selfie, this time with the unflinching guardsman in the background. "Now this is what I call a job, standing around all day doing nothing." He laughed loudly, showing his phone to the nearby spectators. "You feel it too, don't you? That second-hand embarrassment when someone blatantly crosses the line, and you find yourself cringing on their behalf." The tourist took another puff of his cigarette, a cocky grin spreading across his face. Then, amid the chuckles of a few teenagers in the crowd, he raised the cigarette in his hand, slowly moving it closer to William's shoulder. "Hey, if I leave a little autograph here, will I get an award?" he sneered, addressing the crowd with mockery in his voice. His words drew mixed reactions. Some laughed, but a growing number of murmurs began to ripple through the gathering. A man in a long coat, standing toward the back, muttered in disapproval, "This is too much. How can someone act like this?" The woman in the navy coat nodded in agreement. "He's completely lost all sense of decency." But the tourist simply shrugged off the criticism, basking in the attention like a performer in the spotlight. He made another motion, as if to touch the guard's uniform, when a loud voice from the crowd rang out, "Don't touch him! That's not allowed!" "You hear it too, don't you?" That voice was like the unspoken thought of every reasonable person in the crowd, finally given form. But the tourist, once again, pretended not to notice the growing wave of disapproval. "Oh, relax, will you? It's just a joke," he scoffed, carelessly flicking ash to the ground. "They're here for us. What's the harm in a little fun?" The smug tone in his voice only added to the mounting tension. The crowd's energy began to shift. Some continued recording the scene, others whispered among themselves, and a few openly voiced their displeasure. And William? William remained steadfast. His back was still straight, his gaze fixed forward. Yet for a fleeting moment the fingers on the hilt of his weapon shifted ever so slightly. It was clear he felt everything, understood everything, but remained resolute in his duty. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. The atmosphere thickened as if the tension had become a physical presence. From somewhere in the back of the crowd, another voice called out, "Leave him alone!" But the tourist, intoxicated by his perceived power, simply smiled wider. His eyes gleamed with the reckless confidence of someone who believes they can get away with anything. "You see it too, don't you?" The stark contrast between the guard's unyielding composure and the tourist's chaotic arrogance. It's a contrast that makes this moment painfully vivid. Every second felt like an eternity. And though the line remained uncrossed for now, it was clear that the situation teetered on the brink. This story was far from over. When the tourist raised his cigarette toward William's impeccably clean uniform, time seemed to freeze. A single second stretched into eternity. Smoke swirled lazily in the frigid air. The cigarette trembled at the end of an outstretched arm, and every pair of eyes was locked on this absurd spectacle. It was as if the entire square outside Buckingham Palace held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then a firm, commanding voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Step back!" It was unexpected. The guardsman, who had been the embodiment of silent discipline until that moment, suddenly broke his seemingly eternal silence. His voice was like thunder, sudden, powerful, and sharp, and even those standing at the back of the crowd felt its weight in their chests. The crowd froze. The tourist, who just a moment ago had exuded brazen confidence, looked stunned, as though a switch had been flipped in his brain. His hand jerked, and the cigarette tumbled to the ground, arcing down to land at his feet. William took a step forward. The movement, quick, deliberate, and full of authority, shattered the invisible boundary between them. His gaze, now filled with unmistakable fury, locked onto the tourist. That look wasn't merely a warning. It was a line drawn in the sand, one that must not be crossed. "Return behind the line immediately." William's voice was a command, resonating with such conviction that even the wind seemed to pause, unwilling to disturb the moment. The tourist stepped back, his face contorting in surprise. For the first time, he seemed to realize he might have gone too far. "You can talk?" he stammered, as if unable to believe that the statue had just stood up to him. The crowd, which had moments ago been on the verge of condemning the guardsman's silence, suddenly came alive. People began whispering and murmuring, reacting to the sudden turn of events. "Wow," someone said aloud. "He had it coming," another added with clear satisfaction. A few people began clapping. It wasn't wild applause, but a quiet show of respect and support. One man even shouted, "Great job, sir!" Others turned their ire on the tourist. "He should have walked away 5 minutes ago," said the woman in the navy coat, casting a disapproving glance at him. The tourist, though visibly shaken, tried to maintain the last remnants of his bravado. He let out a loud, dismissive snort, still lingering uncomfortably close to the forbidden line. "Come on, it was just a joke," he muttered, trying to save face. "Everyone's acting like I did something terrible." You can feel it too, can't you? That moment when he suddenly realized the crowd was no longer on his side, even if he hadn't yet grasped just how pitiful he now looked in their eyes. The atmosphere in the square began to shift. Some people pulled out their phones to record the scene, others openly voiced their disapproval of the tourist, while a few simply stood in silence, watching it all unfold. But William, the steadfast guard, returned his gaze forward, once again becoming the motionless sentinel he was trained to be. Yet the tension still hung in the air, like the crackling energy left behind after a lightning strike, a sign that this was far from over. Do you feel it too? This isn't the end. Not even close. The crowd was still buzzing with chatter about what had just happened, but most eyes remained fixed on the tourist. He lingered near the boundary line, still trying to appear confident, though his smugness had faded. His gaze darted between the guardsman, the crowd, and the cigarette he hadn't yet picked up off the ground. The scene he had tried to turn into a joke had backfired spectacularly. Then, as if on cue, a new figure entered the scene, a tall police officer in a dark uniform. His stride was purposeful, his expression calm, yet resolute. Amid the chaos stirred by the tourist, the officer exuded an aura of order and authority, like a reminder of rules that couldn't be ignored. He approached, giving the tourist a sharp once-over before glancing briefly at William. The guardsman remained motionless, but his rigid stance still carried a subtle tension. "Sir, you are in violation of the rules," the officer said in an even tone that brooked no argument. The square grew quieter. People leaned in, straining to hear what would happen next. Even those who had been laughing or filming moments earlier fell silent. The tourist, who just minutes ago had seemed so self-assured, tried to defend himself. "For what?" he exclaimed, throwing his hands up. His voice was loud, but there was an unmistakable trace of nervousness in it, I didn't do anything. The officer remained composed. His voice was steady but firm. Your behavior has been disrespectful and unacceptable. You disrupted order and violated the rules. Those words, spoken calmly yet with absolute authority, landed like a verdict. Oh, come on! It was all just for fun, the tourist protested, his face flushing red. I didn't mean any harm. You can feel it too, can't you? That growing sense of desperation in someone realizing they've lost control of the situation, yet stubbornly clinging to the hope of salvaging their pride. But the crowd wasn't on his side anymore. The woman in the navy coat, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up loudly. This isn't fun. You're embarrassing yourself, and the rest of us tourists. Her words sparked murmurs of agreement. A few people even began clapping. She's right, an older man in a long coat chimed in. He should have walked away long ago. The tourist turned toward the voices, his face now a mix of anger and humiliation. He clearly wasn't happy that the crowd he'd tried to entertain was now openly judging him. Please, follow me, the officer said, gesturing toward the edge of the square. This is ridiculous, the tourist barked, clenching his fists. We come here for the show, don't we? Isn't all this for us, the tourists? His words, dripping with desperate bravado, sounded almost comical now. Someone in the crowd chuckled. Another let out a loud snort of laughter. For us, someone called out from the back. Show some respect for the traditions instead of making a fool of yourself. Those words seemed to break what little resolve the tourist had left. His shoulders slumped, his face turned crimson, and his gaze dropped to the ground. He took a hesitant step back before looking at the officer. Fine, I'll go, but this is stupid, he muttered, trying to hold on to the last shred of his dignity. The officer remained unfazed, silently motioning toward the exit. Mumbling something under his breath about how this is all nonsense, the tourist shuffled away. His steps were heavy, as if weighed down by the burden of embarrassment. The crowd watched him go, some jeering while others clapped. That's how you deal with jerks like him, a man in a leather jacket shouted, prompting another round of applause and laughter. As the tourist disappeared beyond the barriers, the tension in the square finally began to dissipate. People started to disperse, though many lingered to take a few more photos. This time, they looked at William with a newfound respect, recognizing him as someone who had held his ground with quiet dignity in the face of blatant disrespect. William, for his part, stood resolutely at his post. His gaze was once again fixed straight ahead, his posture impeccably straight. It was as if nothing had happened, but those standing closest might have noticed a subtle gesture, his fingers briefly adjusting his uniform, ensuring it was as pristine as ever. It was his silent declaration of victory. And you understand, don't you? This wasn't just an incident. It was a testament to how resilience, dignity, and order can triumph over even the most absurd chaos. When the tourist finally disappeared beyond the barriers, escorted by the police officer, the atmosphere in the square noticeably shifted. The tension that had hung in the air during the entire conflict seemed to dissipate. People began murmuring animatedly, exchanging their impressions of what they had just witnessed. Snippets of conversation could be heard. About time they got rid of him. How could he even think that was okay? William, as though nothing had happened, adjusted his uniform with a quick, precise motion. His hands returned to their strict, regulated position, and his back remained perfectly straight. His face resumed its usual expression of calm indifference. To anyone watching, it seemed like just another day at work for him. But those who had been paying close attention might have noticed subtle signs, a barely perceptible movement of his jaw, as if quietly steadying his breath, and a slight tilt of his head, as though mentally recentering himself into his role. The crowd, noisy just moments ago, began to thin out. Still, a few people lingered nearby, continuing to discuss the incident. The woman in the navy coat, who had earlier criticized the tourist, spoke loudly. "Now that's what you call composure. We could all learn something from him." Her comment was echoed by an elderly man in a long wool coat. "These guards are Britain's pride. We should all show them more respect." Not everyone, however, was so serious. At the other end of the square, a group of teenagers laughed loudly as they rewatched a video one of them had taken. The clip showed the exact moment William stepped forward and the tourist, startled, dropped his cigarette.
"Did you see his face? He looked like a deer caught in headlights,"
one of the boys guffawed, showing the video to his friends. And it was true. The video of the incident was already spreading across social media. One clip, uploaded in real time, was captioned, "When you think you can mess with a guardsman but end up learning a life lesson instead." Comments poured in rapidly. "The guard is an absolute legend. That guy totally deserved it. Respect the tradition. Don't turn it into a circus." William, of course, saw and heard none of this. He remained steadfast at his post, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, focused beyond the chatter around him. Yet, even without hearing the online applause, he knew he had done his job. The square began to empty slowly. Tourists returned to their usual sightseeing, taking pictures of the gates and talking about other landmarks. Occasionally, though, someone would glance back at William with newfound respect, and a few even stopped others to point him out. "That's him. See? The guard from earlier." Some took out their phones to capture his stoic figure once again, though this time no one dared provoke or taunt him. If anything, the incident had reminded them to appreciate his presence and the discipline he embodied. Further back, one of those who had initially laughed at the tourist now spoke quietly. "You know, he was right all along. The guard was just doing his job, and we were egging that idiot on." You can sense it too, can't you? The shift in the air? How laughter, taunts, and noise had transformed into respect. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but it's there. Meanwhile, the video of the incident continued to rack up views. Another clip appeared with the title, "Composure is Strength, a Lesson from the Royal Guard." The comments beneath it reinforced the sentiment. This guardsman deserves a medal for his professionalism. That tourist thought he was in charge? Guess not. And yet, William remained as he always was, a figure frozen in time. He wasn't seeking approval, recognition, or applause. For him, it was just another day of service, one he carried out with unwavering dignity. Do you understand now? This wasn't just a conflict. It was a reminder, to everyone on the square and now to countless viewers online, that tradition, respect, and dignity are priceless. They can't be bought or replaced with fleeting attention. And perhaps, deep down, William understood this too. But his face remained as unyielding as ever, because his job wasn't to seek validation. It was to be a symbol, and he had fulfilled that role perfectly.